Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Maintenance of Effort, MOE, and how it pertains to the IDEA Part B grant. My name is Tom Boudreau. I'm the Educational Consultant with the Bureau of Special Education, or BSE, with the Connecticut State Department of Education, CSDE. I want to thank the State Education Resource Center, CERC, for their support in doing this Zoom webinar with intentions to archive this presentation. Here's an outline of information we'll be reviewing today, and I'm placing it at the beginning of the slides in order to make it easier for future reference and access if you say have a specific question or concern. As you see, we have a lot to do, so let's get started. To begin with, there's a saying, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. And that's been attributed to Abraham Lincoln. And that's part of what we want to do today is sharpen our MOE axes as we move forward. So today we'll be discussing Local Education Agency Maintenance of Effort, or LEA MOE. During this section, we will be reviewing the LEA MOE requirements together, breaking these regulations down, relating them to our specific state, and walking through examples. If we have time, general questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, so place them in the chat as we go along. If we do not have time, we'll follow up with any questions and send a response via email or any specific case questions after the presentation. We'll complete those as needed. The primary purpose of this training is to develop your familiarity with and comfort level in applying the LEA MOE regulatory requirements under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So first, we'll focus on developing a basic understanding of the regulatory requirements themselves. Then, sprinkled throughout the presentation, we'll review examples of the LEA MOE requirements at work and in order to reinforce this understanding. The examples will be careful reference after the training. Finally, we'll review the MOE calculator, an Excel spreadsheet that is a requirement of the IDEA Part B LEA sub-grant application, and a closer review of the LEA MOE calculator version 1.4 extended version. This PowerPoint presentation was developed by the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting, or CIFR, and was modified by the BSE for specific elements related to Connecticut and time constraints for this webinar. I want to thank CIFR for their support of Connecticut, who are a National Technical Assistance Center funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, at the U.S. Department of Education to support the state and educational agencies, or SEAs, in reporting valid and reliable fiscal data related to IDEA. In addition to this PowerPoint, they helped develop the MOE calculator for Connecticut and other tools and information around LEA MOE. And these can be found at the web addresses later on at the bottom of this slide, and as well as resources at the end of the presentation. While LEA MOE is a federal fiscal requirement, it's not based on the federal fiscal year, or FFY. When we calculate LEA MOE, we use our state fiscal year, or FY. In Connecticut, our fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. For example, state fiscal year FY 2019 represents budgeting and spending for the 2018-2019 school year. During that period, you use federal, state, and local dollars to provide special education programs to students with individualized education programs, or IEPs. State fiscal year 2019 corresponds to the federal fiscal year of 2018, and FY20 refers to FFY 19, etc. The LEA MOE requirement, as we know it today, first appeared in the 1997 amendments to the IDEA to ensure that federal funds do not replace state and local funding. Currently, maintaining fiscal effort means that an LEA must, for the education of children with disabilities, 1, budget for each upcoming fiscal year at least as much as it expended in the most recent fiscal year for which information is available and which it met LEA MOE. And two, expend at least as much as the fiscal year as it expended in the most recent fiscal year in which the LEA met LEA MOE. There are 4 ways to calculate LEA MOE. We'll be talking in some detail about these methods as we work through the presentation. LEA MOE can be complicated. We've just touched on the basic concepts, and we'll be covering much more detail as we go through the presentation. Let's take a look at the big picture of the LEA MOE regulations. We will look more closely at the specific regulations governing LEA MOE as we work through the presentation. As you can see from this slide, LEA MOE is primarily contained in 3 regulatory sections, although we're going to split them up. The first section we'll examine is at 34 CFR section 300.203. 34 CFR section 300.203A delineates the eligibility standard, which is the budgeting component, and includes the concept of an intervening state fiscal year. 34 CFR section 300.203B details the compliance standard, which is the expenditure or spending component, and is what we typically think of as maintenance of effort. You may be relieved to see in the second regulatory section, 34 CFR section 300.204, that there are some exceptions to LEA MOE. These may be used to lower the amount that must be maintained, and they apply to both the eligibility and compliance standards. The regulations also provide for an adjustment to maintenance of effort in certain state fiscal years when there's an increase in an LEA's federal allocation of Section 611 funds. This adjustment in 34 CFR Section 300.205 interacts with the voluntary use of IDEA funds for Coordinated Early Intervening Services, or CEIS, which we also will discuss. We'll go back to 34 CFR Section 300.203 and look at the subsequent years rule outlined in paragraph C that applies to both the eligibility and compliance standards. And it is important clarification added to the regulatory changes that were released in April of 2015. Finally, 34 Section 300.203D contains the consequences of failure to meet LEA MOE compliance standard, which we'll address toward the end of the presentation, after we show you how to avoid any failures. So let's start talking about the eligibility standard. The eligibility standard is articulated in 34 CFR Section 300.203A. Let's walk through this language. So, for an LEA to establish eligibility for its federal subgrant or subaward under IDEA Part B, it must budget for the, quote, education of children with disabilities, end quote, at least as much as it spent for that same purpose for the education of children with disabilities in the most recent fiscal year for which information is available. That's the basic eligibility standard in its simplest form. 2 things to stick opinion for later in the discussion are: 1, the sources noted in the regulation are the 4 methods of calculating LEA MOE, and we'll talk about these in detail. And then 2nd, pin in the, quote, sources, end quote term, while the other is, quote, the most recent fiscal year for which information is available, end quote. A regulation added in 2015 clarified that this means most recent fiscal year, state fiscal year, in which LEA met the required MOE spending level used as verified or audited data. Again, we'll continue to talk about this and come back to it. So let's see how we understand this regulation. To make sure you're eligible for your subgrant, you have to budget at least as much as you. Which one of the 4 sentences complete those choices best? It's not number 1. Yes, you do need to budget at least as much as you intend to spend next year. However, the eligibility standard for LEA MOE has additional requirements about spending in the previous year. It's not number 2. For eligibility data for the year immediately before the budget year, last year is not final and verified, so it cannot be used as a comparison data. And then there's the principle called the subsequent year rule, which we'll discuss later. It's not number 3, because it's true you must compare to the most recent year for which you have information available. But if you did not meet MOE in that year, you must go back further. So number 4 is correct. It is spent for the same purpose from the same source in the most recent year for which I have information available and met MOE. Again, we'll be talking about this later. Here are 2 examples of how the eligibility standard plays out. In these examples, an LEA's level of effort is being calculated under the eligibility standard for fiscal year 2021. Take a moment to review this. The main point of this example is to give you a foundational understanding of the eligibility standard. Does the LEA meet the eligibility standard in both examples? Well, the answer is that the LEA meets the eligibility standard in scenario B, because the LEA budgeted more, $1 million in 2021, than it expended in the most recent year for which it had audited data available of $900,000 in 2019. Okay, in example A, the LEA did not meet the MOE eligibility requirement for an FY21 grant award because it budgeted less for the 2021 than it expended in 2019. Also, the state fiscal years in the example may stand out to you, and we'll talk through this. When applying for IDEA Part B funds for FY 2021, an LEA needs to compare its budget to the last time it had verified expenditure numbers that demonstrated it met LEA MOE. For most LEAs, the most recent year in which verified data would be your end of year report of FY 2019. If an LEA met LEA MOE in FY 2019, it would need to budget for 2021 at least what it spent in that FY 2019 to meet the eligibility standard. Then you can see how FY 20 would be an intervening year between 19 and 21. The concept of an intervening year may be relevant when applying exceptions and adjustments. We'll revisit this topic and work through examples applying it once we've reviewed exceptions and adjustments themselves. Now, we'll take a look at the compliance standard. The regulation at 34 section 300.203b is the compliance standard. Generally, this requirement states that an LEA must expend at least as much in a state fiscal year as it expended in the preceding fiscal year. That's a short way of saying, and it can be complicated, so let's break it down. Quote, except as provided in 34 CFR section 300.204 and 300.205, end quote. This is a reference to the regulations governing exceptions and adjustments to the LEA MOE. It essentially means that these exceptions and adjustments apply to the compliance standard. As with the eligibility standard, we'll look at the exceptions and adjustments later on in more detail. Expenditures means that the compliance standard is about spending, not budgeting. So, quote, below the level of those expenditures for the preceding fiscal year, end quote, refers to preceding state fiscal year when you met MOE. Here are two scenarios of how the compliance standard applies to the state fiscal year 2020. Okay, in which example did the LEA meet compliance standard? Answer is A, because the LEA expended more, $950,000 in 2019, than it expended in the preceding year, $900,000 in 2018. Why didn't the LEA meet the compliance standard in scenario B? Because the LEA expended less, $850,000 in 2019 than it expended in the preceding year of $875,000 in 2018. One nuance you may have noticed is the state fiscal years in the eligibility scenarios compared to those in the compliance scenarios. As we discussed in eligibility, there's the intervening year, which would be FY 2020, during which you are budgeting for the FY 2021, and verified data is not available for comparison. So the most recent year you have comparison is FY 2019, or the last time the LEA met in that particular method, again, called the subsequent year rule. Unlike the eligibility standard, by the time the LEA has end of the year information for the compliance standard for FY 2020, the LEA would have audited verified data for FY 19. And the most recent year you have for comparison would be FY 2018, or the last time you met LEA MOE in that method. That's the compliance standard in essence. Place any questions you have in the chat, and then we'll try to go forward as we move on. So, remember as we discuss these methods or sources that they apply to both the eligibility and compliance standards. Let's look at these four methods. Both the eligibility and compliance standard regulations refer to four sources for LEA MOE. These sources are really four ways to calculate LEA MOE methods. There are actually only two sources of funds for LEA MOE, local funds and state funds, and four methods that the LEAs may use to meet the LEA MOE standards. These methods are, and again, this is only for special education budgets and expenditures. The methods are total amount of local funds, total amount of combined state and local funds, the per capita of local funds, and per capita amount of combined state and local funds. Per capita refers to the amount per child identified for special education under Part B of IDEA. The total number of these children comes from the official child count of children with disabilities, and that child count occurs on the 10/1 date. LEAs submit to the Connecticut for the submission to OSEP that we send every February, and our state includes children from ages 3 to 21. For per capita methods, you divide the total amount of funds, whether local only or the combination of state and local, that was budgeted or expended for the education of children with disabilities, depending on whether you are calculating eligibility or compliance, by the official child count that was submitted to the SAA for the same state fiscal year for which you are calculating LEA MOE. And an LEA is allowed to use any of these four methods for each state fiscal year. As I just stated, LEA MOE may be calculated by any of these four methods, and the method used to meet LEA MOE each state fiscal year can change. However, the amounts being compared between the current year and the comparison year must come from the same method. So let's look at FY 2019. An LEA could use any of the methods except state and local total, assuming it met compliance in FY 18 for the same method. Can't use state and local because the FY 2019 amount is lower than the FY 2018 amount. Let's say that an LEA chooses to use the total amount of local funds for FY 2019. It also would compare the total amount of local funds to FY 2018, assuming that LEA MOE was met using that method in that year. But for FY 2020, the same LEA cannot use local only total because it expended less in total local funds in FY 2020 than it did in FY 2019. It also expended less in state and local total funds and local only per capita. However, there was also a decrease in child count that would create an exception, which we'll discuss in detail in a little bit. So for now, just looking at the amounts as they are calculated, the obvious choice is to use the per capita amount of state and local funds to calculate LEA MOE. But the LEA also would need to know its per capita amount of state and local funds for FY 2019 and whether it met LEA MOE for that year. We can see that it did, and we already assumed that it met for FY 18. With this example, it shows why it is wise to calculate all four methods each year in keeping your data. So take a moment, a breath. We've certainly covered a lot of information, and we should have basics down. But let's hit some high points. 1, an LEA must budget each year for the education of children with disabilities, at least as much as it expended in the most recent state fiscal year for which verified data are available and which LEA was met. LEA MOE was met. 2, an LEA must expend each year at least as much for the education of children with disabilities as it expended in the most recent state fiscal year in which it met LEA MOE. 3, there are 4 methods to be considered in calculating LEA MOE: the total amount of local funds, the total amount of state and local funds, the per capita amount of local funds, and the per capita amount of state and local funds. 4, LEA MOE may be calculated by any of these 4 methods, and the method used to meet LEA MOE can change each state fiscal year. These do not need to be the same method for eligibility and compliance. However, the comparison method must match the method you choose in the current year. Remember that eligibility standard is about budgeting, while compliance standard is about spending. Those are expenditures. And that for eligibility, you start by looking at the most recent prior state fiscal year for which information on expenditures is available. And for compliance, you start with the preceding state fiscal year. In both cases, you need to go back to the most recent year in which LEA MOE was met. Finally, for both standards, there are the 4 methods of calculating LEA MOE. Again, local only total funds, state and local, and per capita of each. And in its shortest form, that is LEA MOE. So let's look at those exceptions that we talked about. Again, as you have questions, place them in the chat. So we've made it through most of the primary LEA MOE regulation. 34 CFR section 300.203, an eligibility standard, the compliance standard, and the 4 methods. We're about to cover a very important concept of exceptions to the LEA MOE. These are critical components of LEA MOE for you to know and understand, because they can make a difference in whether an LEA meets the standards or not. Exceptions are specific situations that allow an LEA to reduce its expenditures below the level of those expenditures for the preceding state fiscal year, thus effectively lowering the required level of effort going forward. We're going to review these exceptions one by one and walk through them for you. Before we begin with each individual exception, there are a couple of general things you should know about exceptions. First, we're only going to be talking about 4 exceptions that are available for Connecticut. An LEA may have more than one exception in any given year, as you will see when we begin to discuss them. You may take advantage of all the exceptions that apply in a given year, but each must be properly documented and meet the requirements for that exception in that year taken. You need to keep the data around it as well. Second, an LEA may apply all these applicable exceptions to any of the 4 methods for the applicable year in order to reduce its required MOE level and meet both the compliance and eligibility standard. Moreover, the MOE calculator, which we'll be discussing later, calculates each exception against all 4 methods. So when we're discussing examples, we're using whole numbers primarily for the method comparison for the local total in combination of state and local. As we've discussed, the per capita calculations of each can be used to meet MOE, but are not used in the following examples. So exception A. This is when special education or related services staff leave the LEA. It's important to note that it must be voluntary. Someone, say, retires or resigns, or for just cause, such as when employees terminated for misconduct. It does not refer to a reduction in workforce through layoffs or downsizing. In its letter to Lovato, OSIP determined that the voluntary termination of services contract also follows under this provision. So let's look at an example. In this example, the LEA has a veteran teacher that retires at the end of the last school year, and the LEA hires a less experienced teacher for the current school year. The veteran teacher costs $150,000. The new hire only costs $90,000. The LEA can reduce the required level of effort by the difference between the 2 amounts, which is $60,000. The cost for each teacher can include both salary and benefits. And if the LEA had not replaced the veteran teacher, it could have reduced its MOE by the full $150,000. However, it's important to note that the LEA still has an obligation to ensure, in the event that the teacher was not replaced, that continued provision of FAPE, or free and appropriate public education, still is provided to those children in its jurisdiction. In the current school year, then you can reduce the required level of effort by $60,000. Let's move on to exception B. Exception B occurs when there's a decrease in the enrollment of children with disabilities. In the calculation, the prior year's enrollment of children with disabilities is compared to the current year's enrollment of children with disabilities. That's where you determine the difference. The difference in enrollment must be negative to apply the exception. Let's look at how we can apply exception B with an example to the local-only total and state and local methods. Exception C is explained here. Its LEA's required level of effort may be reduced when the LEA stops providing an exceptionally costly program of special education to an individual child with a disability. The LEA can reduce its level of effort the following state fiscal year. This exception can only be taken if the child has left the LEA's jurisdiction, if the child has aged out of the responsibility to provide FAPE, or if the child no longer needs that program of special education. In particular, the last bullet points out requires some discussion. It doesn't necessarily mean the child no longer needs any special education. The child may continue to need special education services, but no longer need the program of services as determined by the planning and placement team, or PPT. In such case, the LEA may take the difference between the two programs. Let's look at these examples. Here are two examples, both related to PPT placements. In this first example, the LEA was sending a child to a private residential facility in accordance with the child's IEP for $169,000. And he graduated last year with a regular diploma. The LEA can reduce its level of effort by the total amount of $169,000. In this example, the $169,000 amount can be deducted from the acquired LEA MOE levels. Let's look at another example. In the second example, the LEA was paying $80,000 for an in-state approved private facility, and the PPT determined that the facility placement was no longer needed. The child returned to the LEA this year with services that cost the LEA $30,000 a year. The LEA can reduce its level of effort by $50,000, which is the difference between what it was spending on the child's program and what it is now spending for the in-district program. In this example, the $50,000 amount can be deducted from the required levels of effort. Now we're going to look at exception D. This fourth exception is the termination of costly expenditures for a long-term purchase. OSIP has informally responded to states that long-term, as it applies to purchases under this exception, means payments that may be made over more than one state fiscal year. Additionally, Uniform Grant Guidance at 2 CFR Section 200.33 define equipment as tangible personal property, including information technology systems having a useful life of more than 1 year and a per unit acquisition cost of $5,000, or an amount equal to or more than an established level. In this example of a long-term expenditure, the LEA is renovating a building for special education purposes over 2 state fiscal years. The 2-year construction contract includes adding elevators, ramps to an old 4-story building, along with accessible bathrooms on each floor, and special ed equipment as accessible pieces, such as chemistry, workstations, sinks, etc. The contract is $170,000 spread over 2 state fiscal years. The LEA expends and includes in its MOE calculation $70,000 in the first state fiscal year of the contract. The work's completed in the second year for the remaining $100,000. Because the LEA was expending the funds against the contract during the second state fiscal year, the $100,000 is included in the LEA MOE calculation in that second year. Under 34 CFR Section 300.704C, there is a fourth exception of where a state is permitted to use a portion of its Section 611 Part B grant to create a high-cost fund for LEAs. These funds come from the portion of the section of 611 grant that is set aside for other state activities. In our state, the high-cost fund is the excess cost grant and is not applicable to Connecticut. So therefore, in the state of Connecticut, we do not use exception E because we have our own high-cost fund, which is the excess cost grant. So now that we've reviewed these exceptions, let's calculate the total allowed exceptions. We've brought over the totals from our examples for the exceptions. We used example 2 for exception C, the termination of exceptionally costly programs. For exception D, the termination of costly long-term purchases. Remember that second year of our 2-year contract was $100,000 rather than $70,000. So the $100,000 appear here. When we add these amounts together, we get a local only total of an exception of $507,568. Note the exception amounts are around the same for either local total or for state local total, except for exception B, which is a decrease in enrollment of children with disabilities. This exception for the state local method was $450 with the combined amount, giving us a total of $670,000 in exceptions for the state and local total method. We'll be discussing exception B with the MOE calculator later on in some example around it, because this automatically goes against your child count numbers and does the calculations for you. An LEA may not need to take all your allowed exceptions to meet LEA MOE by any single method in the current year. However, we encourage LEAs to take all allowable exceptions for all methods. By capturing, recording, and documenting the effect of these exceptions on all methods is very helpful. By doing this, the LEA accomplishes 4 things. 1, it gains maximum flexibility in budgeting by minimizing the required level of effort for all 4 methods. 2, it has exceptions available for the compliance submission to the state with some possible updating. And 3, it meets the compliance standard by as many methods as possible, therefore gaining flexibility for future years. Lastly, speaking of future years, it archives the information for new staff and teams to explain circumstances that impact the LEA's fiscal status in an organized fashion. Now let's take a quick look at the effect of these exceptions on the total required LEA MOE levels. As you can see in our example, where this LEA has all the exceptions to apply in a single year, it can substantially reduce its expenditures this fiscal year and its required level of effort going forward. A similar outcome could occur if, for example, an LEA only has 2 exceptions to take. For example, Section C, Exception C, with more than 1 child not requiring programming, or Exception B, with a significant reduction in child count. An LEA also might substantially reduce its expenditures if it only has 1 exception, such as A, several teachers voluntarily retire. Bottom line, take all the exceptions to which you're entitled each year. The third regulation that details and deals directly with LEA MOE is 34 CFR section 300.205 that covers the adjustment to local fiscal effort that may be made in certain fiscal years. It affords another opportunity for an LEA to reduce its level of effort, but only under very particular circumstances. It's suggested if you're looking to use this adjustment to contact the Bureau of Special Education and use the Maintenance of Effort MOE Reduction Eligibility Decision Tree, which needs to be uploaded as part of the application. In describing this provision, the regulations refer to the funds the LEA receives under 34 CFR section 300.705, which are section 611 funds provided for children with disabilities ages 3 to 21. So, in calculating the increase in funds from one year to the next, funds received under section 619 for children with disability ages 3 to 5 are not included. So when an LEA receives an increase in its section 611 allocation, then it can calculate 50% of that increase. Based on the amount an LEA can reduce its expenditures out of local or state and local by up to that amount for LEA MOE. As always, there are rules and parameters for taking advantages of provisions in the regulations. So let's look at these next. There are several conditions that LEAs must meet if they choose to use the adjustment. An LEA is not obligated either to take any adjustment or to take the full adjustment available. Once again, it's suggested that if the LEA wants to use this to ensure all conditions are met, they should contact the BSE. If it takes the adjustment of an LEA, must use an amount of local or state local funds equal to that adjustment in the same amount fiscal year it takes the adjustment. On other activities, basically, that are allowable under ESSA, Every Student Succeed Act, which is the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind Act. This is required even if the LEA is not using funds under ESSA for those activities at the time. We talk about these funds as freed up funds. Simply put, funds freed up from an LEA's level of effort must be used for other activities in the LEA which are allowable under ESSA. They can be used to expand or supplement existing activities or to begin new activities that are approved under ESSA. An LEA must receive a determination of meets requirements from the SEA, from the state of Connecticut, in a state fiscal year in which the regulation is taken, or the adjustment is taken, should I say. An LEA cannot take the adjustment if the state of Connecticut has taken action against the LEA under Section 616 of the Act, specific to monitoring technical system assistance and any enforcement we've done. An LEA cannot take the adjustment if the SA has been determined that the LEA is unable to establish and maintain programs of FAPE. And finally, an LEA must not have been determined with significant disproportionality for that state fiscal year in which the adjustment has been taken. As you might recall, with significant disproportionality, if you've been identified, there's a mandated 15% set aside that must be addressing that area of that you've been identified under the significant disproportionality piece. So, to be eligible for the MOE adjustment, the LEA must meet several conditions, including details on the eligibility for an adjustment and how to calculate the amount available. They're contained here at the website of the IDEA Data Center's MOE Reduction Eligibility Decision Tree and Worksheet. A link to that tool is shown here, and as well, it is on the e-grant application. It's also included in the MOE calculator instructions and required as an upload for the document if the LEA uses this adjustment as part of your application. So there's no doubt that LEA MOE is one of the more complex fiscal requirements of IDEA. Its interaction with voluntary provision of CEIS, or Coordinated Early Intervening Services, contributes to that complexity. Let's talk about it. We've just discussed the LEA MOE adjustment and conditions an LEA must meet to take advantage of it. But what about voluntary CEIS? Voluntary Coordinated Early Intervening Services are services provided to children who are not currently identified as needing special education-related services, but who need additional academic or behavioral support to succeed in general educational environment. These are high-risk kids. Under 34 CFR Section 300.226, IDEA allows LEA to use up to 15% of its combined IDEA Section 611 and 619 funds to provide scientifically based CEIS to children without a disability in grades K through 12, with an emphasis on children in grades K through 3. Remember, as we previously noted, that LEA was identified with significant disproportionality, it is not permitted to take advantage of the LEA MOE adjustment. Again, that would be comprehensive coordinated early intervening services under the mandated set aside of 15%, which includes both students with and without disabilities. However, if an LEA seeks to provide CES voluntarily, and meets the conditions to take the LEA MOE adjustment, the amount of funds used for one provision affects the amount allowed for the other. We're going to have to review the general rule. Here is a special rule under 34, section 300.205D. Let's talk about it. The total amount used for CEIS and LEA MOE adjustment together cannot exceed the lesser of the total maximum amount available for the LEA MOE adjustment or CIS. Once again, it's suggested that you contact the BSE regarding the use of the MOE adjustment. So, now that we've looked at exceptions and the adjustment, we need to take a step back and look at one of the details I told you to stick a pin in, because we'd be coming back to it. That's the subsequent years rule. We're going to take an in-depth look at this particular detail of maintenance of effort. The federal regulations were revised in April of 2015 to include what is known as the subsequent years rule. We've talked a little bit about the comparison year already, which is determined by the subsequent years rule. The subsequent years rule says that the amount to which you compare for a given state fiscal year by whatever method used is based on the most recent state fiscal year that the LEA met the MOE compliance standard using that same method. This rule applies to both eligibility and compliance standards. Therefore, this may or may not be the most recent fiscal year for which information is available for the eligibility standard, or the preceding state fiscal year for the compliance standard. The subsequent years rule is needed because if an LEA fails MOE by any method, it must meet MOE in the subsequent year by the amount prior to the failure using that method, and not by the lower failed amount. Without the subsequent years rule, LEAs could circumvent the MOE regulation by matching MOE failure rather than success. The good news is that the MOE calculator has a summary page, tab 4, that allows us to have an ever-running detail around what the totals were in relationship to your district, and allows you to have the MOE calculator do those comparisons for us. We'll be talking more about the MOE calculator in a little bit, but let's now look at the newest LEA MOE rule as it applies a more detail around subsequent years rule. I'm going to show you how the subsequent year rule works, using simplified numbers to make the math easier. In Connecticut, we've established a baseline of 2014-15 for all LEAs as met in all 4 methods. So LEAs will need to apply the subsequent years rule for eligibility and compliance testing moving forward. We present here a simplified example that ignores the type of method used started in 2017. This LEA's required level of effort for 2017 was $100, and the actual level was also $100. So the LEA met MOE. In FY18, the required level of effort was $100. And because the actual level of effort was only $90, the LEA would not meet LEA MOE. Note that while the LEA expended $90 in FY 2018, the required effort in 2019 remains $100 from the year it met MOE in 2017. This is consistent with the subsequent years rule. When an LEA fails to meet LEA MOE, the required level of effort remains what it was prior to the failure, and it is not the lower spending level that led to the failure. Because the actual level of effort for 2019 is $90, it remained below the required level of $100, the LEA again would fail LEA MOE in 2019. In 2020, the LEA actually expended $110 and met the required effort, which remained $100 when it was met in 2017, but by raising the amount of funds expended to $110. The LEA has reset the required level of effort to a higher amount of 2021 of $110. So the amount it must expend in fiscal year 21 is $110 in order to meet, because you met in 2020. So there are three important takeaways. First, the required level of effort, whether for budget or expenditure standards, is the amount expended in the last state fiscal year in which LEA MOE was met. Second, the required LEA MOE levels are method specific. That is, to determine what an LEA is expected to budget and expend when using a specific method, you need to look at the last time the LEA met MOE using that same method. The methods may have different years in which the LEA MOE was met last. Thirdly, if an LEA meets MOE by any method in a given year, the LEA meets MOE. For example, an LEA could meet LEA MOE in 1 year using the state and local toll, and the next year it could meet LEA MOE using local only. As long as an LEA meets MOE with at least one method, it meets LEA MOE. I'll say that again. You only need to meet one method of the LEA MOE per year. And it does not need to be the same method from year to year, and you can use it for different standards for the eligibility and compliance. To summarize these points, you can meet MOE by any one of the four methods in any given year. The method you use must be the same in that year and the comparison year. And you must compare your current year MOE amount to the amount in the last year that LEA MOE was met using that same method. Fortunately, the MOE calculator has a summary page that is very graphic and shows which method was met with exceptions, or not met. We'll be reviewing this tool and seeing how these concepts around LEA MOE are actualized next. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about using the LEA Maintenance of Effort MOE calculator. If you haven't done so yet, open your LEA's MOE calculator. It's an attachment on your FY20 e-grant, and follow along with these as a resource, making this part much easier to understand. As well, maybe gather your special education FY19 end of year expenditures and your special education FY21 projected budget, because those will be the numbers we'll be talking about. While you're doing that, I'll explain what the next section will entail. Again, I want to thank Cypher for this PowerPoint, which was developed in concert with them and is modified by the set of slides from the original training I did several years ago. A recap of the end of each section will have kind of a worksheet section and a recap section. Once again, forward any questions or concerns as they arise in these sections, and we'll try to answer general questions at the end of the presentation. Any case-specific questions, or we'll answer those on a case-by-case basis as needed. Again, we're going to be archiving this presentation and these slides, and we'll be sending out to those of you who are part of we have your emails, and we're sending you this information. Now, the tool covers both the eligibility or budgeting and MOE compliance or your expenditures standards. And the version 1.3 runs through the 2019-2020 year. It's the compliance MOE for FY 2019 will actually be completing in version 1.3. If you've not used Excel before, know that everything is there. You just need to look down at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom of the document, and recognize the tab you are in. The presentation in general will look at and provide instruction on completing the MOE calculator tool accurately and provide state-specific information on how the tool is applied here in Connecticut. The MOE calculator is an Excel spreadsheet. That's all it is. It's a complex Excel spreadsheet. And at the bottom of the sheet, it's broken down into clusters of 3 worksheets related to the fiscal year that's being worked on. The worksheets are further referenced throughout the calculator by color code for the purpose of the tab. So all red tabs are amounts pages. Blue tabs are an MOE calculator page, which means it takes information from the amounts page that you put in there and does comparisons to the summary page, and then maybe pulls in any of the orange tabs throughout the calculator, which are your exceptions and adjustment pages. It does all of those comparisons for you from the information that you place in it. A side note is that tab 1, title page, and tab 2, an instruction page, those are available in all the different methods, and they're available for you to review on your own time. The instructions and one-page overview overall are available on the CSD website as well. Throughout the sheet, shaded spaces and throughout the tool are for data entry, while white spaces are filled from other data that's within the tool or document that have been loaded. So all it's trying to do is take that information and place it into white spaces. And remember, as with all Excel documents, always copy and paste, never cut and paste. When you cut and paste, you're going to take formulas that will cause the Excel document to not work properly. Again, the tool has 5 primary worksheets that we will go over today. We'll walk through the completion of the calculator from beginning to end. We're actually going to skip the Getting Started worksheet, which is tab 3. For the MOE calculator version 1.3 already has this information loaded. The basic setup and same information basically will be needed to be placed into the 1.4 extended version, which we'll get into later on. So let's start with the first one, which is the summary sheet or tab 4. It's a graphic way to show whether your LEA meets MOE with or without exceptions and adjustments. We'll discuss the amounts worksheet, which is what data you put in, and then work through each of the exceptions and adjustments, and then return to the calculations to see how they affect the LEA's MOE amounts and determinations. So tab 4, summary page. The multi-year summary page worksheet provides a picture of your LEA's fiscal efforts. In the example, cells D through 3, and that's again, go to column D, look at row 3, go over, and F3 to F7 are filled out. And as you see, the data is placed then calculated into the local per capita numbers in the white cells because they've been calculated. In the example, all cells with data are calculated. In cell H7, the calculator shows local per capita amounts based on the child count, which is in column C, and local amounts that have been entered. In cell J7, the calculator shows the combination of state and local per capita amounts based on the child count and local amounts that have been entered. Note these tabs are white once again because the calculator is calculating the information from the data that was input by the LEA. Fiscal year 2015-16 through 2019-20 are not shaded, and those are been auto-calculated for you in the 1.3 version. So let's look at the completed version because the data was already placed into the amounts tabs in the tool. Here is a completed summary page of version 1.3 from fiscal year 2014-15 through fiscal year 2019-20. Looking at row 1 across the summary page, it has the fiscal year on the left column A, the standard in B, the child count in C, and then 4 methods, and the result across on the top from D through G. The IDA Part B awards are then totaled in the awards in L through N. Column O demonstrates if a shortfall amount and if the LEA fails to meet the MOE compliance test by any of the 4 methods. If this occurs, non-federal dollars are to be repaid for not using IDEA Part B funds properly. We in the State Department would use columns O, P, and Q if needed to record the repayment amounts that were paid to the U.S. Department of Education. In particular, column O, we want nothing to be in there because when compliance is met, nothing will be recorded. So let's look at the amounts worksheets. This is the tab for recording your LEA's effort. They are red tabs. The eligibility standard will enter budget data on the table on the left. Again, eligibility means budget. The compliance standard, or expenditures, will be entered in the final expenditure data in the table on the right. The amounts worksheets are red tabs on the version 1.3. Since we're working with the compliance standard for FY 18-19, you can go to tab 14. This is where expenditure data for compliance would be added on the right. The eligibility data is already on the left. You're going to place in your FY19 end of year special education expenditures. The LEA places in their special education fiscal information. The description and codes, title columns at the top are your decision on how you define those. And again, this can be copied and pasted from any Excel document. As you can see, it's shaded. Place information in the local funds column and in the state funds column. The calculator will calculate the combined state and local in the white cells. The amounts at the bottom of the worksheet are brought into reference into the MOE or blue tab worksheet. Remember, by entering your child count in cell B1 for the eligibility standard, and then for child count for compliance standard in cell I1. If these are not completed, the LEA is wasting 2 important opportunities. Exception B, which is a decrease in the enrollment of children with disabilities, which the tool will automatically calculate you for on your orange tab of exceptions and adjustments. And 2, you're missing out on two methods of the per capita methods of local per capita and the combination of both. These methods are available for you to demonstrate MOE. Without child count recorded in there, you're not going to be able to have these two methods available to you. So, the amounts tab, again, the red colored recap, red colored tabs recap. Special education funds are placed in by the year. You're determining eligibility by the left side where you put in the budgeted numbers, and then on the right side of actual expenditures for your compliance numbers. You're entering in a projected child count around eligibility, and you can have that if you know a student might be leaving or you know that others are coming in, so you put a projected one in there versus the actuals of 10-1 for your compliance side. Fill in your columns, first your local total amount and your state total amount, and the calculator will do all the formulas for you. So, speaking of formulas, let's go into the MOE worksheet, which are the blue tabs in the calculator. Since we're looking at FY 18-19, you can go to tab 15 or any blue tab for the MOE worksheet. This tab is where the magic happens, and it draws information entered that so far has been primarily from your amounts worksheet. It determines whether your LEA has met MOE with or without exceptions or adjustments. Looking at the page, all four methods are listed at the top of this worksheet. For example, method 1, local total, are columns A through C. Method 2, the combination, is columns E through G. So the worksheet shows the determination of each method under MOE result, such as in column C, row 6, which calculated data such as B6 with the amounts that were loaded in the amounts worksheet. And if impacted by different exceptions, which are blocked down below for each method, such as exception A is with the rows 13 through 24. And again, this can be applied to all four methods. Note the area that is blacked out. This is an area that the LEA did not meet criteria to use the exceptions for that particular method. So, one other major element to note on the MOE worksheet is determining which standard is being addressed. In particular, select whether the compliance or eligibility standard is being measured. This is toggled in B1 on any of the MOE blue tab worksheets. So on tab 16, we placed in the FY19 end of the year expenditures, tab 14, and B1 we toggle would be changed to compliance standard, so you make sure that the compliance is selected. When you click back and forth, you might see that the data below may change. For the MOE worksheet is taking different values from different places in the tool. This worksheet calculates MOE for all four methods. Remember, the LEA does not need to meet MOE through all four methods, but calculating all four methods allows the LEA options. In the calculator, we have numbered the methods again. 1 is local total, 2 is state and local total, method 3 is local per capita, method 4 is state and local per capita. The MOE result may be different for different methods, as showed in this sample. Let's look at state and local total method in this sample. First, the calculator determines the comparison year for each method determined by the most recent year in which the LEA met MOE compliance standard for that method. This information is obtained from the summary worksheet or summary page of tab 4. The calculator also determines the comparison year amount, which is the amount needed to meet MOE by this method. The calculator pulls in your LEA's state and local total amounts from the data you entered on your amounts worksheet. The calculator compares that amount with the comparison year amount to determine if your LEA has met MOE. In this sample, the LEA has met MOE. The LEA in this sample has met MOE without needing any exceptions or adjustments. Because the LEA met using state and local method without needing exceptions or adjustments, the tables for exceptions and adjustments are blacked out, meaning that they're not needed in this method. So let's recap a little bit. Looking at the MOE worksheet with 4 methods. Again, the MOE worksheet is where the magic happens, and it pulls from other places. That's why most of the cells in the MOE worksheet are white. The green one to be toggled is in B1. So the MOE calculator will be required as part of your application. The MOE calculator is going to be uploaded as part of the eGrant. You're going to ensure that toggle B1 on the MOE calculator for the blue tab for the standard being measured. The MOE worksheet tab 14, again, is the compliance for 1819 we'll be looking at. And it must be met at least one method. Now, let's look at tab 16, our any orange tab in the exception and adjustment worksheets. When reporting MOE, your LEA should enter information on any relevant qualifying MOE exception and adjustment in that year. It will auto-populate the MOE worksheet we just reviewed by putting in this information in there. The exceptions and adjustment worksheets provide a place for you to document each allowable exception and the MOE adjustment permitted under IDEA regulations. This information will help if you did not meet MOE based on final expenditures or any shortfall in all of your methods. You might meet MOE based on the exceptions and adjustments. Even if you meet MOE by one or more of the methods, you should consider entering all exceptions and adjustment data, since the information may be helpful for future years if your LEA needs to switch methods. Again, this is the subsequent year rule that we talked about. Note that in Connecticut, we only have 4 allowable exceptions. We do not use exception E. So, the exception and adjustment worksheets for any year has 2 sets of data tables. The one on the left is the eligibility budget, or the budget side. Just like on your amounts page, eligibility is on the left, compliance is on the right. We'll review exception A and C in detail. Exception B is calculated for you when child count is placed in. And in section D was already explained in relationship to earlier examples. So let's look at exception A. This may be used when it's reduction to required MOE amount based on the voluntary departure by retirement or otherwise, or departure for just cause of special education or related services personnel. Let's see how the calculator does this exception. First, enter information about all departing personnel, including your salary, your benefits from the local or state and local funds. Next, enter the same information about any replacement personnel. The calculator will calculate the difference for you. This information is going to be brought into the MOE worksheet in order to address any shortfalls. If this is not sufficient space to list all personnel, you can include a summary on the exception and adjustment worksheet and provide detailed information on the LEA worksheet, meaning tab 24, it's the final tab in the calculator. You can hold information here for those different fiscal years. For example, you could list all departing special education teachers on the LEA worksheet and calculate a total for their salaries and a total for their benefits. You could then enter these totals on the exception adjustment tab in one line item. Quote, special education teachers, see tab 24. You could repeat this for other types of positions as needed, such as paraprofessionals or whatever. Exception C is the allowable exception for an exceptionally costly program being modified or stopped. Exception C is used to reduce the required MOE amount when an LEA is no longer obligated to provide the costly program for a participant child with a disability because, one, the child has left the jurisdiction or agency of the agency or moved the program from one to another, has reached the age at which the obligation of the agency to provide FAPE to the child has terminated, which would be 21, or no longer needs the program. If there are questions about determining costly programs, certainly contact us. But in general, for each student in a costly program that's terminated, you enter your student SACID number. You then use a drop-down menu for the reason, such as the termination of the obligation of the agency that provides special education. Finally, all expenditures are placed in there so that you have an understanding of what the program was. Once again, you can use tab 24 if you have several students who have a similar reason, have it read in relationship to see tab 4, moved out, total amount, and then that's the reference. So quick recap. Exceptions and adjustments worksheet. The exceptions and adjustment worksheet has two sets of data tables. The one on the left is for the eligibility standard for that year. Just like in your amounts tab, the budget eligibility elements are on the left. And the one to the right is for compliance, the expenditure standard, so that when things happen for that fiscal year in relationship to why you didn't expend the same, if not more, you explain it in your exceptions and adjustment page on the right-hand side. Allowable exceptions are filled in. You have exception A around voluntary departures, exception B about your decrease in enrollment, okay? And exception B, again, is calculated for you by putting in child count. Exception C is there for the costly programs around services for students with disabilities. You're recording those numbers. Exception D for the long-term purchases. Again, we do not use exception E. That'll be blocked out in everyone's programming. So again, there's another way LEA can reduce their budget to be spent. This is the MOE adjustment. We've addressed this already, but in particular, once again, to be eligible for the MOE adjustment, the LEA must meet several conditions. The IDEA Data Centers MOE reduction eligibility decision tree and worksheet would need to be completed and uploaded into your e-grant. There is a space included in the calculator and instructions as well where you place in the funds. When you've determined the amount of available adjustment, you enter the amount taken up to the total available adjustment. For this example, we indicate an adjustment of $7,000, meaning there was a $14,000 increase from last year. Thus, a 50% reduction of that would be $7,000, and all the other criteria were met. Note, once again, for you to use the adjustment, you would have to upload the worksheet. We recommend you speak with the Bureau of Special Ed to make sure you meet all the criteria. So, let's see what happened to the MOE tab now that we've entered some data for your exceptions and adjustments. You can see that new data are entered into the tables for exceptions and adjustments. We'll look at how this changed the results of local per capita method 3. There goes. This shows that the LA did not meet MOE just with expenditures. They need to include exceptions to meet MOE. It says did not meet in pink. The LA had an initial per capita difference, 355, but they had a per capita exceptions of more than 844. This means that the LEA now has met MOE using exceptions. The LEA does not need the adjustment to meet MOE, so adjustment is not shown. You can see how the calculator has pulled data from your exceptions and adjustment worksheet, brought it into the box underneath, and allows for the exception to be applied to your shortfall. Let's look at how the exception adjustment information has changed results on the state and local per capita method. The child count used to determine the per capita exceptions and adjustments and this child count method from last year is demonstrated. Now we return to the summary page, tab 4, to see how the data we have entered elsewhere is represented. The calculator presents the final amounts and results for each method, local to local, state and local, local per capita, and state and local per capita. So we're almost at the end, but we need to review the LEA MOE calculator version 1.4 extended. The need for version 1.4 extended is due to the 1.3 version of the Excel spreadsheet can be completed for the compliance standard, but not for the eligibility standard. Let's look once again at a completed 1.3 version. Here is a 1.3 version, a summary tab sheet. As you see, the eligibility standard for FY21 IDA Part B application is fiscal year of 2021. It is not on the tool. However, the LEA can still complete tab 14, the amounts tab, with the end of the year expenditures. This was placed in your compliance side on the right side of tab 14. Remember to go up and toggle B1 so that it says now compliance, because currently in the 18-19 B12, I can't see that well, standard is eligibility. We've now moved to the summary page and see the change in B11, the compliance from eligibility. Go back. It was eligibility in B11. Now it is compliance because I toggled the B1 on the MOE worksheet. See the standard changes in B11 compliance from eligibility. In the example, the LEA has met compliance. The version 1.3 is complete and can be saved for uploading into the FY21 application. Now we need to complete eligibility. The LEA will copy the data cells B8 to K12 and version 1.3 from tab 4 and going into tab 5. Sorry, back up. Circled in blue, see the blue circle there? And paste values into tab 4 cells B3 through K7 in the extended version. Let me explain that again. To complete eligibility, the LEA will copy the data cells from B8 to K12 in version 1.3 from your summary tab. It's circled in blue here. And you're going to paste the values cell. So when you go into the paste, make sure it says values. That's what you're looking for. In the tab 4 of your extended version into cells B3 through K7. Here is the 1.4 extended version. The LEA will paste values. Again, this is important. You just don't want a picture. You want the numbers to go in there because it needs to compare to the last time MOE was met, remember? And we're going to copy this from version 1.3 into tab 4 or your summary page into cells B3 through K7 in the extended version. These will then give the comparison years to the 1.4 extended and allow the eligibility standard to be completed. Thus, now by going into tab 5, the amounts tab sheet on extended 1.4 version, and placing in your projected budget for FY 2021 on the left side of the worksheet. Here is a completed version 1.4 extended. The eligibility standard has the tab 5 amounts worksheet completed. And in this case, exceptions and adjustments, or tab 7, was completed as well to meet the eligibility standard with exceptions. Tab 6, the MOE worksheet, did the comparisons and are expressed on the tab 4 summary page. The extended 1.4 version is ready to be saved and uploaded into the FY21 application. As you see, the next years through 21 through 25 will be available for the LEA to demonstrate MOE through the 1.4 version extended MOE calculator. Reviewing again, the Getting Started worksheet, or tab 3, needs to be completed by the LEA for the version 1.4 extended. The data can be copied from the 1.3 version. Once tab 3 is complete, you'll not need to return to this tab unless instructed to make changes in the future. It's important that B9 asks about the high cost fund. Once again, Connecticut does not operate a high cost fund under 300.704. So in cells B9 through B17, the CSD has select no for each of those years. So to recap, the 1.3 version for MOE compliance is for the standard of 1819. You're going to copy data from the 1.3 and paste those values into the 1.4 extended version. Complete your 1.4 extended version for the eligibility standard. You're going to ensure that tab 3 is completed with information from the 1.3 version into the 1.4. Both the 1.3 and 1.4 versions are required attachments for the FY21 IDEA Part B application. Speaking of the application, here is the eGrant portal. Some of you may not have been in here for some time. This is the means by which that we're going to be doing the FY21 IDEA LEA subgrantee application for section 611, which is 3 to 21-year-olds, and section 619 for 3 to 5-year-olds. You're going to click into the email address. That is your username. And if you forgot your password, follow the instructions. There is a change in the application around MOE on how to report MOE. The good news is that we no longer are going to require districts to place in values. Only the district will identify if you've met with exceptions, or did not meet for both the eligibility and compliance standards. The eligibility standard, you're going to choose one. Not met, met with exceptions. And if it's met, you're going to indicate the source. The source meaning local to local, combination of state and local, and per capita of each. If it's met with exceptions, you're going to indicate your source, and then you're going to record which exception was used. Be it that you used it for exception A, B, C, or D. Now, there is a warning that will come up because you can submit the application with not met. But checking not met indicates that the LEA is unable to meet the MOE eligibility standard and would be ineligible for the FY21 IDEA Part B funds. And we tell you to contact the Bureau of Special Education to explore options regarding exceptions and your projected special education budget. Once again, if you click not met, all 4 methods, you are unable to meet the eligibility standard for MOE, you will not get the grant award. There'll be a warning in the submission that by clicking that and submitting it that way, not met for eligibility standard indicates the LEA is unable to meet MOE eligibility standard and not eligible for the FY21 IDEA Part B funds. For compliance standard, you're going to choose one, just like the eligibility standard. It's going to be either not met, met with exceptions. And as a side note, again, you're going to be taking the information from your version 1.4 extended around the eligibility. And for the compliance standard, you're going to be using your 1.3 version. You're going to choose not met, met, or met with exceptions. If it's met, you will indicate the source, which is either local to local, combination of state and local, or per capita of each. If it's an exceptions that you're using as a means by which to meet the standard, you'd record which exception was used. A, B, C, or D. By checking not met, there's a warning there. It indicates the LEA is unable to meet the MOE compliance standard. You need to contact the Bureau of Special Ed to explore options regarding adjustments and exceptions regarding actual special education expenditures. Once again, you can submit the application and there'll be a warning that comes to you. That submission of not met for compliance standard indicates the LEA is unable to meet the MOE compliance. Contact the Bureau of Special Education to determine next steps, which may include repayment of federal, non-federal dollars. So if you weren't able to meet in any of the 4 methods, column O would show the amount that you owe in non-federal dollars and the steps by which that we would then take by which to recover those funds. Once again, related document pages, both 1.3 and 1.4 are required as part of the application. The application is going to be posted in March. It will be due in May. As I shared before, some of the resources specifically for your 1.4 version is the website that has the 1.4 version in it, as well as some instructions on how to transfer the information from 1.3 to 1.4. Here are specific resources around Cipher and the resources that they have in regarding. So in closing, I'd like to say the fiscal resources there are listed for your supports. Again, the webinar will be archived on the CERC website, and we'll send this out, but so that you have resources for educational team members moving forward. Here are fiscal resources on the CSDE website that are available for you to review and have available. Again, I'm available to assist LEAs for assistance on matters relating to the IDEA Part B grant. I'd like to, questions or technical assistance are available with Greg Glidden, who is with the State Education Resource Center. He's available for contact and be it through Zoom or even in person to manage and help you get through these challenging pieces. And as well, any questions around seminars or webinars or future trainings, certainly contact Steve Profit, who is a consultant with the State Education Resource Center as well. One more proverb for you, that no matter how hard the past, one can always begin again today. And so that's what we're doing. We know we had some challenges, we're moving forward, and we're doing good things for students with disabilities. So we do have some time, and I'm going to review any final questions that are in the chat from the CERC piece here. Let me just turn this around. And okay, we have some questions here that I want to go over quickly. Okay, what is the newest version of MOE calculator we are supposed to use? We will need to re-enter the prior year's information. You're going to be using the 1.3 version, which you already have as an upload on your eGrant. In the eGrant, there is a template of the 1.4 version, as well as showed you where on the State Department of Education is the 1.4 version. Both versions are required for the application. Under the 1.3 version, you're going to complete your compliance for 18-19 is the comparison year for FY20. Again, this is our intervening year, right? We're in FY20. We don't know really how much we've spent yet, and we don't know what we're working on for budget. So the budget is then the FY 2021, which is completed on the 1.4 version. Very good. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Further questions, reach out to me, and we'll keep on keeping on. Have a wonderful day.